There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. It's the early hours of March 8, 1973, and the Whisky A Go-Go nightclub in Brisbane's Fortitude Valley is winding down after a busy night. Iconic Aussie band The Deltones had already wrapped up their set, so most of the club had started to clear out. Only about 50 patrons sticking around to continue drinking and revelling in the joys of a night out. It's an assorted mix of stragglers, a father and son celebrating the purchase of their first racehorse, military personnel enjoying a night off, musicians from the group Trinity, another band who'd taken to the Whisky stage that night, all walks of life and ages. But what they don't know is that their nights out are about to end in tragedy, with 15 of the remaining patrons losing their lives in what will at the time be Australia's worst mass killing.
It was March 8, 1973 when the Whisky A Go-Go nightclub was firebombed. Within minutes of two 23-litre drums of fuel being thrown into the downstairs foyer and ignited, 15 innocent people in the club upstairs were dead.
What happens at the Whisky A Go-Go just after 2 a.m. will end up being part of a major conspiracy theory that persists to this day, despite inquests, court cases, and many theories as to who was behind it. Was it a hit by rival gangs wanting a piece of the Brisbane nightlife? Was it corrupt cops looking to cash in on an insurance scheme? Did it involve some of the most notorious crimes known to Queensland authorities? And why did the deaths linked to the Whisky continue long after the flames were extinguished? I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. The Whisky A Go-Go fire is just as much a mystery today as it was in the hours after the tragedy that took the lives of 15 people in Fortitude Valley on March 8, 1973. Police would start a major investigation that would drag in some of Brisbane's most well-known criminals, gangsters, bosses, and violent offenders who'd spent time together in jails over decades, creating networks and ties that spread down the coast into Sydney. But the investigation would also expose police and political corruption, with a group of officers who were on the take from those very criminals potentially using this fire to help some club owners cash in. Was it meant to escalate as it did? Were those 15 people meant to be victims, or were they just in the wrong place at the wrong time, with an arson attack that went far more successfully than the perpetrators ever planned? Matthew Condon is a prize-winning Australian novelist and journalist whose most recent book, The Night Dragon, details the Whisky A Go-Go series of events. He's also the host of Ghostgate Road, a podcast that touches on some of the identities tied into the Whisky A Go-Go conspiracy. He joins us now. So Matthew, can you first of all take us into Brisbane's Fortitude Valley in the 1970s? Because now it's kind of bright and shiny and there's lots of fancy nightclubs and eateries and it's been a bit gentrified since then. But what was Fortitude Valley like in the 1970s?
Well, it's fascinating because the valley, bright and shiny in some respects, it still has in its soil a sort of dark underworld atmosphere. There's still a lot of hijinks that go on in this precinct. But back in the 1970s, it was the Wild West. I mean, literally, it was sort of Brisbane's King's Cross. It was where you had illegal gambling, sex workers, and all manner of nefarious activities that were happening in this little hub called Fortitude Valley, which is just a kilometre or two north of the Brisbane CBD. But it was the place where you could get anything at a price, and its reputation was very seedy.
who were the biggest players of the time? Like, we've obviously seen the Underbelly series and we can name off gangsters from Sydney and Melbourne now, but who were the big players in Brisbane at the time?
There was a lot of Machiavellian activity in the 1960s, courtesy of the corrupt police system in place at the time known as the Joke. So Frank Bischoff was the Commissioner of Police from about 1958 through to 1969. During his tenure, this is when the fabled Rat Pack or trio of corrupt police officers, Terry Lewis, Tony Murphy and Glenn Hallahan, rose to the ranks and worshipped at the feet of Bischoff. They were his bagmen, and in essence, the unique thing about Queensland in this period and onward, until it all imploded in the 80s with the Fitzgerald inquiry, was that the police actually controlled criminal activity in Queensland. They allowed people to come in and out of the state, as in various criminals. They ran the brothel systems. They took the kickbacks. They orchestrated bank robberies, jewellery heists, and in some instances, murders. So the police were in control. But there were some crime groups that were favoured by these corrupt officers. One was a group called the Clockwork Orange Gang. Now, these men met in Bogger Road Jail in the 1960s. So you had teenagers who had committed various offences, carjacking, sexual assaults, and they find themselves together, young men, in this Brisbane jail. Now, they included Vincent O'Dempsey, who would go on to become a notorious serial killer and gangster, Gary Dubois, John Andrew Stewart. All of them were fermented in this little group, and they went from being teenage criminals to fully blown adult gangsters. And it all happened in the 60s. And of course, the bulk of them were released in the 70s. And of course, they spilled onto the streets of Brisbane and started their activities around Fortitude Valley and so on. So it was a very, very volatile decade, right from the very beginning of the 1970s.
So the Whisky A Go-Go fire is the one that really attracts the most of the attention, but some of those players that you just mentioned were involved in fires in the valley in the lead up to the Whisky A Go-Go fire and very closely in the lead up.
That's right. At the start of the 70s, in 1972 and into early 1973, there were, as you said, a number of fires at restaurants and nightclubs in Fortitude Valley. This began with a fire at a little club called Alice's Restaurant. It was followed by a very serious fire. Thankfully, no one was injured at the Torino's restaurant in the valley. It was a Sunday night and the windows of that restaurant and that building were blown across the street. It was an horrific attack, and as I said, thankfully no one was present. And that, in turn, 11 days later, was followed by the tragic fire at the Whisky A Go-Go nightclub. So you had a sequence of events leading up to this big and tragic event at the Whisky where 15 people lost their lives.
In the early hours of March 8, 1973, Fortitude Valley nightclub Whisky A Go-Go is firebombed. 2 fuel drums set alight in the foyer, leaving 15 people dead, asphyxiated from carbon monoxide poisoning.
All over Australia and overseas, there's been reaction of complete revulsion to the fire killing of 15 staff and patrons at the Fortitude Valley nightclub. The nightclub in St Paul's Terrace was gutted just after 2 o'clock, claiming more lives than any other mass murder in Australian criminal history.
And it's just shocking. It was deliberate, so uncalled for.
There were just bodies everywhere.
That night in 1973, it's a Wednesday night. Was the Whisky A Go-Go busy for a Wednesday night at that time?
Let's put it this way. The Whisky A Go-Go, compared to other clubs around at the time, was considered pretty much your last chance saloon, if you like. It was a bit tacky. There were rumours that sex workers were working out of there. There were gangsters seen coming and going. But on this particular night, on the Wednesday night, as you said, that was the night of March 7, 1973. There was a very, very popular band called the Deltones, which were playing at the Whisky. The Whisky hosted a live music event and there was a dance floor. And the Deltones were very, very popular. So it drew in a crowd. When the Deltones finished, which was only a matter of 10 minutes before the actual fire, there were about 50 people, as well as staff members inside the club.
So one of those people is 22-year-old Kath Potter. Now, she decides to leave to find her boyfriend. Now, she thinks that he might be at another club nearby. But back in those days, there's no mobile phones, no one's texting each other. So she has to go to a payphone, which is just outside. And she's there around 2 a.m, which is right before everything starts to go terribly, terribly wrong. What does Kath witness?
So Catherine Potter was a young woman who worked in the city and she loved going out to clubs. She knew the manager at the Whisky Go-Go, John Bell, and he was very kind to her. So she loved going out. She loved going dancing. And as you said, she was waiting on a new boyfriend and he didn't turn up. So she thought she would go down out of the club to a nearby phone box and ring around the other clubs like Checkers, etc., to find out if he was there. Now, while she was in the phone box, she alleges she looked over to the entrance to the Whisky Go-Go. Now, just picture this club. It's only 2-story high building, ground level, and then a first floor. The entrance is in Amelia Street, which is off the main drag of St. Paul's Terrace. And Kath claims, as she was ringing around these clubs, that she saw a black vehicle pull up and 3 men get out. 2 of the men retrieved drums of fuel. She claims she saw a large sort of wick in one of these 44-gallon drums, and then suddenly she saw flames. And that's when she panicked. She was with a girlfriend and they raced across the road to where the girlfriend had parked her car and they took off. She is adamant after 50 years still that there were 3 people splashing that fuel around at the front of the Whisky at about 2:08 a.m.
From the beginning, it was rumoured there were more people than just Finch and Stewart involved in the firebombing. In fact, a woman who's expected to give evidence at the inquest says she was in a phone booth nearby that night and saw a car pull up in front of the nightclub. She says 3 men got out and took out of the back seat what appeared to be large drums. When she looked back, the club was on fire.
Now, just before that goes down, and we don't have an exact time for this because she can't remember, but Donna Phillips is a waitress in the club, and she said at one point after midnight and before 2 a.m. when this unfolded, that the phone rang in the club, which she says is unusual because not many people called the club anyway. But what does she say was strange about that?
So the situation was with Donna that just prior to the fire, she was asked by management to man the front desk of the club, even though, it was very late and the likelihood of people popping in was slim. But she said the phone rang asking for one of the owners of the club, Brian Little. And it was after that phone call that Little and his partner departed swiftly from the club. So Donna's memory is that it was, with hindsight, it was a warning that something bad was coming and that the owners needed to get out.
Did police know this? Was there ever a check into whether the owners of the club knew that something was going to happen and that maybe that they were even involved in it?
The question of the police investigation in this case goes to the very heart of one of the problems with the Whisky and why people have remained asking questions after half a century about what happened. There's been a new inquest which occurred in 2021 and 2022, and the coroner has yet to deliver his final report. But it's impossible to believe that we're still trying to disentangle this event. But it makes more sense when you understand how intricate and complicated the situation is behind the scenes. And one of those problems was the police investigation, to what degree any police might have had in wanting to cover up a scenario that they were involved in, that wanted to perhaps railroad and charge specific people in order for other people to get off the hook. It's a very, very murky situation. The proof of that murk, we'll come to this, but there were 2 people that were charged with the Whisky atrocity. They were very quickly tried and found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. With a new generation of police revisiting the issue of the Whisky Go-Go, police found that the actual transcript of the trial was missing a critical tranche of papers. And the section that involved the prosecution questioning police involved in that initial investigation have gone missing. They've just vanished. So that points to an attempt by someone at some point to try and break the breadcrumb trail and somehow not exonerate, but make it more complicated for people at a later date to actually work out what actually went on. So there's 100 of those sorts of situations flying around the issue of the Whisky A Go-Go.
Well, let's head back to that night after 2 a.m. Kath says she witnesses these men pull these 44-gallon drums out of a car and place them in the entryway of the nightclub, which the majority of people, other than Donna, who is supposed to be manning the front desk, are on the second floor. They're up a pretty narrow staircase. What happens after those drums are lit?
So those fuel drums and the fumes from the fuel itself ignited, obviously, and raced up the stairs, up that 2-level set of stairs into the northern end of the club. It was burning carpet along the way. It was burning furniture. It was burning cladding on the walls. So what happened very quickly was that the club was overwhelmed with noxious black smoke, so black to the point where patrons couldn't even see the exit signs. So you have this space where the windows have in fact been bolted shut so that they can't be opened. And within 2 minutes, 15 people in that club died of asphyxiation. So they were overwhelmed by the smoke. There was no flame damage, if you like, to the victims. It was all the toxic smoke that killed them very, very quickly. Some people smashed windows and jumped out and injured themselves. Others got out through windows in the performers' green room, if you like, at the back of the club, and others managed to force open a side door near the kitchen. The actual primary exit doors, which would have saved many lives, were actually jammed up, and in the end they found a number of bodies on top of each other near that exit. So it happened very, very quickly. But 1 minute people are drinking and dancing, the next second they're gasping for breath and fighting for their life. So terrible scenario.
Matthew, what do we know about the victims?
They were, as you'd expect, a range of people. There were young women out on a hen's night out for a good time. There was a man and his son from country Queensland. They'd come in to do some business and thought, what the heck, let's go to this club and have a drink and catch up with friends. And of course, there were the staff members like Decima Carroll. She lived nearby, not far from the club. Her daughter told me that on that final night, the daughter and the 2 other little sons, her children, were in the bathtub. Mum was on night shift. She poked her head into the bathroom, said she'd see them in the morning and that she loved them, and never came home. So there are, singular tragedies all over the place in this story, and young people and young barmen and people that should have had a full, long and happy life, and it was just cut short in an instant.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with novelist and journalist Matthew Condon about the Whisky A Go-Go fire in 1973. The police investigation begins almost immediately, and they scoured the city looking for all known criminals that they could haul in and start questioning. And then they also fly up Roger Rogerson from Sydney, who we now know was very corrupt during his time on the force. What is happening in the immediate aftermath of that fire when they're rounding these men up to question them? Who's being hauled in and who are the main suspects?
Well, they don't have any main suspects, but they are literally throwing out the net and bringing in possible offenders, the worst of the worst in Brisbane. And of course, in that net, they capture and bring in very quickly a gangster called Vincent O'Dempsey and his friend, a man called Billy McCulkin. And they are questioned by police and allowed to go free. However, about a day after the fire, we have coming into focus John Andrew Stewart and his buddy James Finch. So John Andrew Stewart, this notorious Queensland gangster, he went to the infamous Westbrook Home for Boys up at Toowoomba, as many of his fellow criminals graduated from that home. And then he established an instant reputation for himself on the streets of Brisbane. He was extremely violent. It would take very little provocation for him to stab, for example, another human being. So it's very quickly, they're bringing in 70, 80, 90, 100 men. And there's almost this stroke of genius or this light bulb moment that came in somewhere that now, yes, it has to be Stewart and Finch. So we have to find them. Now, Stewart, through his solicitor, said, look, I had nothing to do with it. And Finch was later apprehended with Stewart on the Sunday after that Thursday morning fire. Now, by now, they were the primary suspects. I still can't understand how that deliberation came about from the law enforcement side of things.
Is it true that Stewart had been warning people that something like this was going to happen?
Yes, so Stewart, who many people claim was ridiculously intelligent and had a very high IQ, but he was such a loose cannon and so very dangerous. So he was making a nuisance of himself around town in the weeks leading up to the Whisky A Go-Go while these other fires were occurring, basically saying, look, I have information, I'm not involved, but I have information that there's going to be a fatal fire at a nightclub. The source is going to be Sydney gangsters who are going to come to Brisbane in order to flex their muscle and extort money from clubs, restaurants, pubs, etc. in Brisbane. And they're going to make a big statement by burning a nightclub with people in it. And no one believed Stewart. This is a loudmouth animal, as he was described by many people, and could blow at the click of a finger. His temper was so ferocious. Brian Bolton, a journalist for the Sunday Sun in Brisbane, which had its headquarters in Fortitude Valley, had known Stewart ever since he was a teenager up at Westbrook Home for Boys outside Toowoomba in the 1950s. So for Bolton, Stewart was a source for some stories, even though he was a criminal in his own right, John Andrew Stewart. Now, Stewart tapped his friendship with Bolton and said, look, this is the information I have, you should run with it, it's a great story. And that's what Bolton did. He ran some stories that said, get ready, I have information that Sydney gangsters want to take over Brisbane. So you can imagine the scene was set where suddenly there's little fires appearing and people are going, well, maybe Brian Bolton's right. But on the other hand, you think little old Brisbane, I think the population of the city at that point in the early 70s was about 900,000. So you have this small town, it's got its fair share of gangsters, it's got crooked cops who are extorting money left, right and centre. So you wouldn't think there'd be any room or cash to extort for Sydney gangsters. So a lot of police mocked this suggestion at the time, and the police commissioner, Ray Whitrod, although he took it seriously enough, it didn't appear that it warranted any great further investigation prior to the Whisky going up. So this is the scenario that was set up leading towards the fire. It was John Andrew Stewart unbelievably performing a public duty and saying, look, this is what I've heard, you need to be prepared.
2 men arrested just days after an inquest was opened. John Stewart and James Finch, convicted of the murder of the youngest victim and jailed. Stewart dying in prison 6 years later, while Finch was paroled and deported to the UK. He died earlier this year, taking any secrets he had about the horrific crime to his grave.
So these two are formally charged just for one murder, despite the fact that 15 lives had been lost that night. Do we understand why it was only one murder and what happened during that court process?
Okay, look, I may be wrong, but my understanding is that at the time, the single murder charge was representative of the 15, if you like. I think it may have even been a matter of a judicial custom whereby the enormous time taking it would have been if they'd been indicted on 15 individual murders that each one would have to have been tried. The one charge was to embody the whole, if you like. So there was very quickly a committal hearing. Stewart and Finch claimed that shortly after their arrest that they had been what's called verbaled by corrupt police, including, as you mentioned, Roger Rogerson. Finch and Stewart claimed that false confessions were typed up, allegedly that they had given, which they said they didn't. They never signed either of the confessions and claimed that they were convicted on the strength of those two confessions and thus falsely convicted. Now, the issue of the verbal and what went on in those police cells in the Brisbane CBD after they were captured, the only person alive that was present is Roger Rogerson. And he, at the most recent inquest, vehemently denied there was any verbal. So the committal moves forward very swiftly to a trial later in the year. Stewart is so insistent that he is innocent that he disrupts the trial and court process spectacularly by swallowing pieces of wire. He's in and out of hospital. There is even part of the trial was heard at his bedside in hospital. This was his absolute foot stamp saying, I'm innocent, I was verbaled, I did not do the Whisky A Go-Go fire. And he did that by self-harming in a shocking way. They were ultimately and quite quickly found guilty of the murders and dispatched to life in prison, both of them. And for several years after, Finch continued his spectacular protestation of innocence. At one point, he climbed onto the roof of the Bogger Road jail and spelt out in bricks that he had been verbaled. Still, he was going on, banging on and on about how he was innocent and had nothing to do with the crime.
What happens from that point on? Do either of them ever crack and admit to the crime? What happens from there while they're behind bars?
So on New Year's Day in 1979, John Andrew Stewart is found dead in his cell. There had been rumours swirling around that he had kept a secret coded notebook that told the entire story of who was behind the Whisky A Go-Go firebombing. It was never found. His mother would claim that he was in fact poisoned in prison. It wasn't suicide, and there didn't appear, certainly from the examination of the body, that he came to any specific foul play. But this story, it's difficult to believe anything you see or hear. Everyone has a story about it. Finch would remain in prison for a number of years. Then, interestingly, at the height of the Fitzgerald inquiry into police and political corruption, which began in 1987, and during that 2-year Royal Commission, there was great agitation in the public by certain groups. There was a group called Friends of Finch. They were insistent that Finch himself had also been falsely imprisoned and convicted on these murders. And so they began a very powerful campaign to have him released, right at the height of the inquiry where everybody was questioning what had happened in the past. You know, what was the truth? Who was straight? Who was honest? Who was not? And incredibly, Finch, the government agreed to release him, and he was deported back to the United Kingdom. And that was the last we saw of him. I mean, unbelievably, on the first day of the new inquest into the Whisky in 2021, minutes before the start of proceedings, a rumour flushed around the court that, in fact, in the previous 24 to 48 hours, James Finch had died at his home in Essex in the UK. And it was later confirmed that he had died, well, we were told he had died of a COVID-related illness. So literally hours before we were to re-examine his role in all of this as well, he died. It adds another strange dimension to this never-ending story.
Speaking of another strange dimension, it's funny how over the years, as people get older and people's lips get a little looser, you start to hear about a meeting that was held in the days before the Whisky A Go-Go fire, which included some very, very powerful people and could probably play into these theories that there was a hell of a lot more to it than just a little bit of extortion by some gangsters, and that this might go very, very high up the chain. Who was in that meeting and what influence would they have had on these nightclub fires?
Yeah, this meeting was raised at the inquest as well. There were lawyers, there were bank managers, there were insurance representatives, and from what we've heard, there was the presence of the thoroughly corrupt police detective and member of the Rat Pack, Glendon Patrick Hallahan. Now, Hallahan had been wreaking havoc in the force since the 1950s. It is believed he committed several murders himself. He was extorting people left, right and centre. And now here he is popping up at a meeting matter of days before the Whisky Go-Go goes up in terms of, and what was the meeting about? Well, the implication, if the meeting ever happened, was that the powers that be were signing off on this hideous crime going ahead, and that it may have been related to insurance payouts, etc., etc. So people still, to this day, are trying to work out what actually happened. Now, why do we have to ask that question after such a long time? Why do the victims' families, many of whom were at the most recent inquest, have to relive the horror of this decade after decade? Because something was wrong with this story from the start. Something was wrong with the police investigation. There were cover-ups. There were some heavy players that we may never know that may have been behind this that were protected. There were a string of murders that followed the fire and the trial of Finch and Stewart, of people linked and associated with this story to maintain that the truth never emerged. Documents have gone missing, files have vanished. You know, we don't know the full story and we may never know it.
Well, if we think about that meeting, that lends itself to a theory that there was some insurance fraud potentially going on there. And even Kath Potter, who we spoke about earlier, who went out to the payphone that night, says that when she went back out again into another nightclub owned by the same people, the Little Brothers, that she was pulled into the office and questioned about what she saw that night. She had also been approached by police and told, "Are you sure it was 3 men?" And when she said yes, they said no, it was 2. They wanted her to change her statement. So all of these factors start to come together to look a little bit like insurance fraud. Have the Little Brothers ever been questioned about potential involvement in these fires?
Yes, they were in fact interviewed at the most recent inquest and denied any such activity. That meeting with Kath Potter was very interesting. I mean, Kath Potter herself has suffered from people simply not believing her evidence. I believe her. I believed there was a meeting. She was talking about seeing 3 people get out of the car. Now, why this is critical is because the police story, if you like, the narrative from the beginning was that there were only 2 people. And that fits very nicely with the arrest and conviction of Finch and Stewart. 2 people were involved. So it was, in my view, and in terms of the evidence and in terms of research and documentation, this is the situation. Finch was definitely there because he later, when he was deported, virtually admitted that he torched the fuel.
Jim Finch, you have always claimed that you were home in bed in the early hours of the 8th of March 1973 when the Fortitude Valley Nightclub, the Whisky A Go-Go, was firebombed. In October that year, a judge and jury found you guilty of the crime. You swore police set you up. The relatives of the victims of the fire have had the anguish of never really knowing what happened. You have asked me to England to tell me the real story behind the Whisky A Go-Go. For those grieving relatives, your supporters, the police involved and the people of Queensland, tell me, Jim, were you really home in bed on that dreadful night?
Hi, Dennis.
Were you involved in the firebombing of the Whisky A Go-Go?
I was.
He later retracted that in an embarrassing scenario whereby he was informed that he might still be charged. In addition, he walked back on those allegations. So I think Finch was there. I think Billy McCulkin, the local gangster, was there. And in fact, I spoke to a man who was a nightclub singer at a club not far from the Whisky called the Flamingo, and Stewart was in that club between about 2 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. at the exact time of the fire. People saw him. People gave evidence that he was constantly asking the bouncer at the door of the club, "What time is it? What time is it?" So he was establishing an alibi for himself that he wasn't outside the nightclub and he wasn't a part of torching the club. I believe Stewart was primarily involved behind this crime with Finch, with Billy McCulkin, and I think there may have been another member of the Clockwork Orange gang that was a part of it. And I believe also that the gangster Vince O'Dempsey may have had a hand somewhere in this crime. The efforts of 50 years and the confusion and the obfuscation all comes down to who planned it and who did it. And we've never had a fully satisfactory answer to those questions, despite trials, inquests and re-inquests. We still haven't come to an answer on that. I don't know whether the Queensland coroner may provide a furtherance of the narrative that we at this point understand courtesy of his report. That's entirely in his hands, and it will be fascinating to read his findings. I don't think any other people will be freshly charged in association with this terrible event. But all the families want is to get a clearer picture of what really happened. That's what this is all about.
Now, as someone who's lived and breathed this for more than a decade now, and some of the players that we're talking about are still alive, so I don't know how afraid you are for your own safety with some of these people still getting around the place. I mean, they are quite elderly now, but still. What do you think is the most likely theory? Extortion from gangsters, insurance claim involving a lot of very high-profile people, or is there a crossover between the two?
Okay, what do I think? I think there is some credence to this, that Sydney organised crime figures were a part of this. I think there was a proposition by them to extort money from various clubs, pubs and restaurants in Brisbane. To do the job, I think they hired locals, and that included the mad John Andrew Stewart, and I think it included some members of the Clockwork Orange gang, who we know, courtesy of trials that came decades later, we know the Clockwork Orange gang were behind that big bombing at Torino's only 11 days before the Whisky A Go-Go. So I think that Sydney masterminds and gangsters and criminals, the top echelon, have ticked off on an attack in Brisbane as an attempt to stand over and extort money. They've outsourced the job to local Brisbane criminals. They've gone ahead with the job. I don't think there was any great intention to kill 15 people and establish that crime as the worst, non-Indigenous mass murder in Australian history, right up to the Port Arthur situation. So I think it got out of control. It got out of hand. Suddenly 15 people are dead and they scatter everywhere. And thus begins this attempt to quash or hide information, to in fact try and wrest back and control a singular narrative which made Stewart and Finch the scapegoats, even though I think they were absolutely involved, but there were more people involved. And that's been the issue. Who else was behind this terrible crime? To understand that, then we could make more sense of this mass murder.
Matthew, when are we expected to find out the outcome of that inquest?
A little birdie told me it would be July of this year, 2023, but I can't be certain on that. It took 4 years for inquest to begin from when it was announced by the state government. It's now been almost 2 years since the first hearings. I imagine it will be at some point this year. I can't see it extending any further.
And you have little hope that we'll have any more resolution as to what exactly happened that night in 1973.
I don't know what the coroner and the counsel assisting, in fact, have been privy to privately that wasn't made public. Perhaps people have come forward outside the parameters of the formal hearings to assist and give witness statements afresh from people that they may have never heard from. I hope that the coroner can deliver perhaps the most as definitive as it can be with what we have left available to us. I mean, witnesses, so many witnesses are dead, and Finch and Stewart are dead, and all of these characters have now vanished. But I hope there can be a furthering of the narrative for the sake of the victims' families.
Thanks to Matthew for assisting us to tell this story. Next week, we'll delve into one of the murders that happened right after the Whisky A Go-Go fire, involving one of the men who may have been involved in that arson attack, and why one person's knowledge of those events meant 3 more innocent people had to die. In the meantime, if you enjoyed our coverage of the Butcher of Bega in previous weeks, we've just dropped a 3rd instalment just for Mamma Mia subscribers. A first-hand account of Jodie Pierce's experience with former obstetrician Graham Reeves.
I had to go back to the labour ward and, you know, legs in the stirrups and all that sort of thing again, which I cried over that because I just didn't want to go back there. It was just too much for me at that point, you know, to even, you know, think about, it was just a traumatic experience.
To find out more, follow the link in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Claire Murphy. Our executive producer is Gia Moylan, with assistant production by Tali Blackman. This episode's audio design is by Scott Stronach and Madeline Joannou. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.